Hello and welcome to the Horti-Culturalists. I'm Stephen Ryan.
And I'm Matthew Lucas.
And we post a video every Friday. So why don't you hit subscribe and the alert button so that you can keep up with what we're doing.
Indeed. And Stephen does a Q&A on a Monday in our shorts. So if you've got a question for Stephen Ryan, put it in the comments below. Tell us where you're from in the world and Stephen will try and answer your horticultural problem in 60 seconds.
We will do it, or I will do it.
I'll just read the question.
Yes, that sounds
fair. Now, Stephen, it is raining, it is thundering.
Yes.
Where are we? Under a veranda.
Yes, well, we're actually sheltering at the moment, and we're in one of Mount Macedon's other and very important hill station gardens called Cameron Lodge. So that's where we are.
Lodge. I'm already feeling the highlands. It's a very beautiful garden. So what is it about this particular garden that we're going to look at today?
All right, well, there's going to be some lovely trees because
Yes.
there's some really impressive, important specimens
I can see some
of
amazing
all sorts of
ones behind
trees.
us, yeah.
And I'm not actually going to tell you what the creme de la creme of this garden is until we get down there. But there's something towards the bottom of the garden.
There's something in the bottom of the garden.
Yeah, and it ain't fairies. So we're going to have a look at something really impressive and interesting at the bottom of this garden that William Cameron created.
Wow, well, I can't wait for that. But first then, let's go and look at the tree that's actually right there behind your head. Because
Yes.
that struck me as we came in. I'm curious. Let's go and have a look.
All right, what a good idea.
So let's take the stairway down. So
Yes.
Stephen, tell me all about this garden. When was it planted? Who was the owner?
Yes, all right. Well, the earliest owner I can find was an Edward Woods, who was actually part of the Melbourne Stock Exchange, and he bought the property, called it Rahiri, and owned it for some years.
Yeah.
But the most important owner was probably William Cameron,
Yes.
who the first thing he did was obviously change the name of the property to
Cameron
Cameron
Lodge.
Lodge. So he didn't believe the old fable about name changing, where it's supposed to be bad luck. But anyhow, William Cameron was a very important businessman. He owned, with his brothers, a huge tobacco company.
Okay,
And
let's gloss over that.
No. I think it's really quite interesting because at one stage they were supplying about 75% of all the tobacco products in India and Australia.
Oh.
So it was big. So there was lots of money made out of this particular company.
Yes.
And he retired to this property at Mount Macedon after his grand tour of England and India, and hence the sort of Indian hill station look to the property.
Yes.
I mean, the house has a look like you would see in a wealthy Raj house up in Darjeeling or Kashmir, and as does something else we're going to see, but I'm still not going to tell you about it quite yet.
Oh, okay.
So William Cameron owned this property for some years, and he was very famous.
Okay, hold out on us, but I think we've arrived at our first pit stop.
Yes, well, we may have done.
Now, this tree you can spot from a mile off. Look at that trunk.
It is. It's very impressive. It's
Yeah.
one of the largest specimens in the garden here.
Yeah.
And rather appropriately, it's a Sequoiadendron giganteum, which in America is called, rather prosaically, the big tree. And it is. It can have the largest volume of timber in it of any known tree in the world. So it's not the tallest, but it is the bulkiest, I guess you'd say. And in England, of course, they're often known as Wellingtonias.
Yes.
And the reason for that is that when it was first named Sequoiadendron, there was some back push on that because they didn't think it was an educated enough name. So they wanted to name it after a very important person in England. So it's often called Wellingtonia still, even though that name wasn't given legitimacy, and Sequoiadendron stuck. So there you go.
And where's it a native to?
Well, it's native to the Californian area in the US of A. It has become one of those iconic park trees almost anywhere in the world where this tree can be grown. So you'll see them all over the place in Victoria here. Everyone had to have a Sequoiadendron. And of course, all of the big gardens on Mount Macedon would have had one as well. And most of them still do have.
So conditions, what can it take? Heat, dry, cold?
Well, it's very cold tolerant. It will go down to quite low temperatures. You can grow them over most parts of England and North America. They don't like tropical heat, but they'll cope with dryish heat like we have here in our Mediterranean style climate. And they're reasonably drought tolerant in the summer once they're well established.
So what is the Californian redwood that you hear about? What is that?
Well, that's Sequoia sempervirens. It's not
Right,
this. So it's another genus. And so, of course, Sequoiadendron just means sequoia tree. So they were obviously aware of a relationship there. But they are in separate genera, and they're both monotypic. So there's only one species of Sequoiadendron and one species of sequoia. So there you go.
Okay. Well, I'm loving this garden. The rain has cleared.
Yes.
We should go and
temporarily.
Yes. We should go and look at something else.
What a good idea.
Well, Stephen, as we were just walking down from the house, this tree struck me. So for all intents and purposes, it looks like your average cedar. What cedar is it?
It's the Indian cedar, Cedrus deodara.
But it's got this cortex, Stephen.
It almost looks like
Is it a cortex? What's going on?
Well, it's interesting because when I was a wee child and used to come here to swim in the garden and play here and learn from the head gardener here, who was a great advocate of mine as a young child, this tree was actually growing in a large circle of stone that had been built up to around about, in fact, that height.
So like a retaining wall?
Yeah, it was a circular, it was a giant pot with no bottom in it, basically. But it was made out of concreted stone.
Right.
So it would have been planted in it as a young tree. And as the tree grew, I can remember it actually slowly cracking away the stonework. So the stonework eventually fell away and has been taken away. Right. And so the tree had obviously rooted down into the ground below. And this is actually its root system that would have been up in the pot, or whatever you'd want to call it, originally.
So this line here is where the soil level should be.
Yeah, that's where the soil level would have been when I was a child. And so it was odd to look at even then, because you had this circle of rock that was quite high. It was, up to my neck virtually, with basically a trunk sticking out of it, because all of the soil had been used up by then and the tree had gone down into the ground below. And so it was just a matter of time, as the tree got even wider and wider, that all that stonework had to get pushed aside.
Curious initial planting choice.
Yes, it was. It should have been a dwarf conifer for the container that they'd built. But anyhow, who knows why they selected that.
Now, the second thing is, often with trees and shrubs, if you do plant it too high or too deep, it has a negative effect. So kind of unearthing it has obviously had no issue, caused no issue.
Well, it's generally better to have something that's higher in the ground than something that's too low in the ground, because the root system then is down where it's going to get less air, and trees don't really work well if the soil's built up around their trunks too high. And obviously with the deep mountain soils here, I mean, the soil on this property would be 2 or 3 feet deep with a friable clay below. So the roots could go down quite deep. The tree's perfectly sound and perfectly happy, just slightly weird looking.
All right, well, that I have loved, but there's something else I want to ask you about just over there.
Yes, let's go and have a look at something else.
And Stephen, the other tree I just loved is this one here. What is it?
Yes, it's a conifer, and it is a Japanese cedar.
Yes.
It's a selected variety which revels under the name of Cryptomeria, japonica, Globosa Nana. And the cultivar name, Globosa Nana, is sort of obvious. Globosa meaning globe-like, so rounded.
Ah, yes.
Yes. Nana, on the other hand, means dwarf.
Okay.
And
it's not very big.
It's not very dwarf either for a dwarf conifer. This would have been planted here in the 1950s or early 60s by Mr. Morgan, who was one of the owners of the property, and he was here when I was a small child. So he was the one that allowed us entry to this garden to go swimming in and things.
Lucky you.
And he was a fanatical dwarf conifer collector, so I'm quite confident it would have been part of his original collection. And a lot of his collection's gone now, because many of them were planted in tubs and urns around. And when one of the many owners decided to re-landscape, they were seen as being persona non grata, and all the dwarf conifers in tubs disappeared, sadly.
Oh, that's a shame. Goodness. Fashion can wreak havoc. Well, that is absolutely beautiful. The other thing, though, there's a lovely juxtaposition with the maple. So there is this maple here, and there's a bronze coloured one over there, which we'll show. And I've just noticed, firstly, we've done an Acer special, but the seed pods on the bronze one are bright scarlet.
Yes, the samaras, as they're called, two-winged seed pods or seed vessels. There's actually 2 seeds attached to each stem, and they drop to the ground like a whirligig or a helicopter. So that means if the wind picks them up, they can blow quite a distance so that the tree can sort of shed its seed all over the place.
But I've never seen such a bright scarlet.
Yeah, they often are.
Oh, okay.
And generally speaking, the darker foliage ones tend to have the redder seed. So I'm assuming that the colour actually translates throughout the plant.
Interesting, because I actually thought that was a flower nestling in the foliage. So it's beautiful.
Yeah, and they're great plants. It does go to show, though, weeping maples, or for as small as people think they are, they're not a good plant on either side of a set of steps unless you've got grand steps, because they'll just meet in the middle.
Okay, let's go and look at something else.
Yes, what a good idea.
Oh, Stephen Ryan, you've lured me down here for variegation.
Yes, well, what can I do? And thunder and lightning.
Very, very frightening. We're on a mountain the thunderstorm has passed. But anyway, well, okay, first things first. From a distance, this tree does look extraordinary, and you know my feelings, everyone, perhaps you don't, but watch the other video about variegation. So what is this?
Well, this is a variegated form of the sweet chestnut.
Oh, I can see the nuts forming.
Yeah, don't ever expect to get a crop from it, though. It's not particularly productive. It's an ornamental version, really.
Yeah.
And it's Castanea sativa argenteo marginata. So silver-edged, basically, argenteo marginata.
Chestnut, we can call it.
Now, this tree and I go back a long way, funnily enough.
Do you?
There is a story, and I'm going to tell you the story because I think it's quite interesting.
Okay.
There was a nursery on Mount Macedon called Sangster and Taylor Nursery, which was only a kilometre away from here.
Yeah.
And in that property, up until comparatively recent decades, there was one of this tree, the silver variegated one, and there was one of the golden variegated one. They were both in fairly poor condition.
Yeah.
The golden variegated one had reverted a lot to green. They'd both been through the Ash Wednesday bushfires of 1983 and had been burnt. And so they were in very poor condition. But they were still there and growing. And so I got some propagating material from them, sent it off to a friend.
Does that mean cuttings?
Grafting material, so actually signs for grafting, so that they could be grafted onto seedlings.
Right,
yes,
not signs.
S-C-I-O-N-S, signs.
Signs.
Yeah, so I got some signs organised, sent them off to some friends in the Dandenongs who were far better at grafting than I am.
Yeah.
And they grafted some up. I got a couple of the plants back, which I made sure ended up in a couple of our gardens up here.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, this isn't one of them and it's the best, but anyhow, I'll get to that in a minute. So they grafted them up and they, of course, kept some themselves and they grew them on and they sold a few. A couple of the plants ended up in a garden in the hills in Adelaide via this nursery. And some busybody who came into that garden said, those trees shouldn't be in Australia. They've never been imported. They don't exist here. Somebody has smuggled those trees in. So they dobbed these people into the agricultural department because, of course, it's related to an important commercial crop tree.
Yeah.
So if it had been smuggled, there was going to be some serious issues.
Heads would roll.
Heads would roll.
On the variegated chestnut front.
But anyhow, it got weirder. So the poor person who bought these trees was contacted by the ag department and they said they'd bought these trees from the nurserymen in the Dandenongs that I'd supplied the material to. So the ag department then rang them and said, where did you get these trees from?
Stephen Ryan.
They said Stephen Ryan. And they actually sent an operative from Adelaide on a plane over here. And I had to take him to the old garden where these trees still were, although in very poor condition, and point out that the tree had actually come into Australia probably in the 1890s and had never found its way around through gardens. So he looked at the trees, got back on the plane and disappeared, never to be seen again.
Thank you, taxpayers' money.
Yeah, well, exactly. So why they couldn't have just rung me and asked me to take a picture of the trees or just believed me when I told them that's where the trees were.
Who would believe you, Stephen?
Yeah, they had to cite them. So this is sort of a replacement. Those trees, by the way, are now gone. They both died and have been removed. And so with that little bit of me rushing out, getting some propagating material and getting it propagated up, I've kept this tree in Australia. So there you go.
Saved by Ryan.
Yes. Yeah. What can I say? I think it's exciting, and this tree will need to be watched. It's got a couple of small reverted pieces in it, so there's some green bits up in there. So I'll have to have a chat to the owners and make sure that they're aware that they need to get those cut out before they get too big.
Few things. Firstly, it's a very handsome tree. Secondly, the variegation is really beautiful because you know it can sometimes just look diseased.
Yeah. I have to say the gold one isn't as good.
Right.
as a plant. I'm
was
glad
gonna
it's still
ask
out there, but
the difference is.
but the gold one has a gold centre to the leaf as opposed to a silver edge.
Yeah, I wouldn't.
And I'm pleased it's still here, but you know, if I was going to plant one, this would be the one I would want anyway.
And then, so is this, what's this?
That's the male flower, where the pollen would have come from,
Yeah.
and that's the female flower just there, or the remnants of it that is turning into the female pod.
Oh, here we go, boys and girls. Once again, I'm constantly learning about the boys and the bees. So I guess the issue is, what would happen if you germinated these seeds?
There's two things that could happen, because variegation normally doesn't travel through into seed. But there's two things that
really?
can...
Ever?
No, usually.
Usually.
Yes, I'm being very cautious about this because it can happen. But usually seedlings from this would come up as a green one if it does produce viable seed, and it may or may not. I've never tried to raise a seed. The other thing that can sometimes happen, and I've done this with another variegated tree that I raised some seed off, not that I wanted them to be variegated necessarily, I just wanted the wild species, and it was actually one of my cornices that had variegated foliage, and I thought I'd like to get some seedlings going that I thought were going to be green.
Yeah.
What in fact happened is a lot of the seedlings came up completely albino and died. They got up to sort of just past seed leaf stage.
No chlorophyll, ladies and gentlemen.
And most of the seedlings just died. So the variegation can actually transfer into some plants via seed, but in general it doesn't.
Right. Now, the other observation is that this does not look, we'll show you the trunk, but this does not look like a grafted specimen.
It was.
But it has to be.
Yeah, it's been grafted. The graft is probably right on ground level. So, and because it's Castanea sativa grafted onto Castanea sativa, it's not a dissimilar understock, so the trunks won't look that different. You might just get a slight line, but that's about all.
Right.
So it's actually, you know, grafting like onto like, you get very much less obvious sign of the graft.
So back to square one, where are chestnuts a native to? What's their original climate zone?
The chestnuts come all the way through the sort of Mediterranean basin, and they've been sort of taken into other parts, and there's certain parts of the Mediterranean that they're not native to, but they've become well entrenched in. Places like Corsica, for instance, they had a huge chestnut industry there, and they still have ancient chestnut groves in Corsica. And of course, a lot of these plants were used way back for the flesh of the nut was used like a flour substitute. So they grind it up, and it still is.
More thunder.
More thunder, lightning. We'll have to find something gothic to finish off with on this film, I think.
So then, climatically, it's Mediterranean, which means it can take droughts.
Yeah, they to an extent. They generally come from the hills,
Right.
so they're not low altitude things, so they grow up in the foothills where there's more moisture, where it's cooler, and the best chestnuts all seem to come from hill station type areas. And certainly in Victoria we've got quite a buoyant chestnut industry, and it tends to be up in the northeast of Victoria where most of the chestnut groves are in our state. So it's cold in the winter, can be warm in the summer, but not necessarily really hot, and not desperately dry.
Right, so it is ideally suited to many gardens, so particularly like in Britain, in North America. It can take the cold, but it also is not your classic Mediterranean drought-tolerant tree. No,
it isn't. And of course, we've got to remember too that when chestnuts were brought into America, they had their own native species, and a nasty bug got in with the exotic chestnut, and so chestnut blight basically wiped out the native chestnuts from North America, which is very sad because they were magnificent and beautiful trees.
And there are none?
Well, I'm assuming there's some lurking around a little bit, but the big groves of the American chestnuts disappeared when the blight came in.
That's terrible.
And it's very sad to see what we can do by, well, ignorance really, not knowing what we're about.
Hopefully, because I'm an optimist, some of those native chestnuts will have survived and they will develop immunity. Evolution will roll on, and in 100,000 years there'll be groves of chestnut trees in the States again.
You can hope that. The same thing happened, of course, with elms in England.
I was going to say.
With Dutch elm disease. And they are, actually, man has stepped in to a certain extent, and they've used the remnant elms that didn't seem to come down with the disease, and they're breeding new forms of English elm that they're hoping will be, in fact, resistant to Dutch elm disease, so that the elms can then find their way back into the English landscape.
There you go. Well, for a variegated tree, I've loved this. Well, I'm keen to see what else this garden has to offer.
Well, lots. I'll show you some more.
Okay, let's go.
All right, Matthew. Here we have some stonework that shows you what the container or planter would have been around that really large Indian cedar we saw earlier.
It makes sense now.
Yeah, so they were built to, I guess, show off specimen plants around the garden. The cedar probably was a poor choice at the time.
Well, in their defense, maybe they thought it was a dwarf, because all of these containers contains specimen holly.
Yeah.
So not a big shrub, not a big tree. It actually works. So maybe that was the idea.
Yeah, well, maybe they did think the cedar was a dwarf form. I don't know. But anyhow, it sort of adds interest to the story. And it is, or these are a few of the last remaining ones of these in the garden here. And it's still got the sort of shark's toothy top on it. It's quirky. And William Cameron could be said to have been a lot of things, a fairly powerful businessman, probably quite pedantic about things. And I can remember him, I can remember being told of him in this garden, because he was gone before I arrived, walking the garden with Mr. Cowper, who owned one of the other big properties up here. And he was obviously acquisitive like everybody else. And he apparently turned around to Mr. Cowper and said, "See that plant over there?" And I just wish I knew what that plant was. He said to Mr. Cowper, "That plant is really rare and I've got 6 of them." And Mr. Cowper turned around and said, "Well, they're not rare in your garden." So I love the sort of attitude to gardening back then.
You gardeners. Well, that actually brings me to another question. When was this garden initiated? What era are we looking at?
All right, we're looking at the turn of the 20th century, basically, is when William Cameron took it over sometime around about then, and he was here till about late 1930s. So it's during that period that he would have done most of the structural work in this garden.
But before that, so when was the house built, roughly?
Well, the house is much extended and so forth in William Cameron's time. It would have been a much smaller cottage when Edward Woods owned it, and he had it back in the 1870s-ish.
Right.
So it goes back to that time, about the time when a lot of these properties were in fact settled. So that 1870s, 1880s was a time when a lot of wealthy business people and people from the sciences and things all got their Mount Macedon properties to come to in the summer.
So some of the planting could be from that era, some of those massive cedar trees.
Yeah, I would say that some of the bigger trees on the property do probably date back to Edward Woods, and maybe even earlier. He was the first owner I could find any record of, but there's nothing to say there might not have been somebody else here running this property even earlier, and so some of those trees could date back even earlier.
There you go. All right, good to see a little bit of Mr. Morgan still here.
Yes, well, it's nice to see sort of layers of owners in a garden,
Yeah.
because a garden's a little unlike a house. I mean, a house, you can take it back to its original form and colour and what have you. You know, you can take that lean-to off the side or whatever. But a garden has to evolve and change as it goes, because trees grow, shade becomes an issue in some parts.
Yep.
And so you've got to adapt a garden to the circumstances in which you find yourself now. Everybody has different taste when it comes to plants and gardens as well. So,
And it's their garden, as you often say to me,
yeah,
Stephen,
that's
right?
exactly right. They've all put their time, effort and energy into keeping Cameron Lodge going.
Okay.
And now, Matthew, for
Yes.
the big reveal.
Yes.
Here we have something that Mr. Cameron put into this garden
Yeah.
after his grand tour that I consider to be Mount Macedon's most important and largest of follies.
Wow, look at that. It's so beautiful and romantic. You know, the first thing that strikes me is it's very much like a temple in the garden of Stourhead,
Yes.
in Britain, which is a stunning landscape, a British landscape garden with amazing collection of plants and dahlias and trees.
Yeah, and wonderful structural features within the garden
And a
as well.
temple not unlike that. Wow,
Yeah,
it's
well, see,
stunning.
one has to wonder, because I've always seen it as sort of an Indian extraction when Mr. Cameron did his grand tour, but maybe he copied it from Stourhead. I don't know, but there's a couple of things about it that I don't think you would have found at Stourhead, like the fountains.
Yes, well, we'll go and have a look at those. What are they?
Well, they're brass, and there's 2 of them that are in fact elephants. There's one that's a seal, which is on the far side. We'll have a look at that as well. And I think there's a 4th one, and I can't even remember what it is. So there'll be a reveal for me as well.
Oh, I'm desperate to see what they are. And you were calling this a folly.
Yeah.
So here we go, semantics.
Yeah.
For me, that is not a folly. It's like a garden pavilion. For me, a folly is like a fake ruin or a fake water mill or a fake Gothic church or an abbey ruin with ivy that you've built.
Yeah, well, that could be one definition of a
Yes.
folly, but I would use a much more general definition of a folly in that it is a structure within a garden that is ornamental but not particularly useful.
Right.
So, you know, I mean, you could have easily put a little gazebo up or something, but instead, let's spend some serious money and, in fact, be very silly about it, and we'll build something that is, well, a waste of money. So as far as I'm concerned, follies all fall under the category of they aren't necessary for the garden. They are probably a waste of money in some ways, but they can be stunning features.
Hence, it's a folly.
Hence, it's a folly. Yes.
Well, I think we need to go into the temple and just have a closer look and find these fountains.
Yes, what a good idea.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay, just before we go across, Stephen, are they the only steps over to it?
They're the only way over. We've always known them as the elephant's footprints, and they're stepping stones. Well, they're actually pillars that stand up in the muddy water, and that's the only way to get onto the Temple of the Winds. So if I fall in, hopefully you've got the camera ready for some dramatic footage.
Oh no, I'm suddenly not loving this.
Yes.
All right, let's cross over to the temple.
What a good idea. Well, no, it's not a good idea.
Not a good idea.
No.
Off you go, Stephen.
All right, well, aren't you going to follow me? Anyhow, here we go.
I'm going to manage the camera.
Oh, right. I've got to move the bushes out of the way to start with just so I can see where I'm going. And, oh, look, I'm better than I thought I was. Now, this is sort of being pride before a fall, potentially. No, I'm going to make it. Look at this. Now you've got to do it, Matthew.
Carrying the camera and trying.
Ta-da! Here I am.
All right, here I come, Stephen. I can only do this with one hand.
Yes.
Where are they? There we are.
Yeah, once you get past that bush, it's not quite so bad. Don't fall in, Matthew.
All right, I'm just going to take a pause because there we are. There is the elephant fountain. Oh, there's another one over there.
There's two elephants.
Beautiful.
There's a seal there.
Okay. Well, here we are.
We have made it.
The Temple of the Winds. I was slightly nervous about those steps in case they wobble.
We took our life in our hands just for our filming, so I hope everybody appreciates it. So we're now sitting on the steps on the Temple of the Winds. This takes me back to my childhood, definitely.
So you swam in the body of water around this temple?
Yes, it was one of the bodies of water that as kids we swam in, and I can remember getting into serious trouble by the head gardener when we accidentally knocked over one of the elephants. But there you go.
It's very beautiful, and there is a Temple of the Winds in the Melbourne Botanic Garden, not dissimilar.
Same sort of vague shape, although they've used the staghorn motif around the tops of the columns. This used to have, I think, quite beautiful glass doves that sat on the roof of this.
No, that sounds kitschy to me.
No, they were beautiful. And it was part of the, well, I mean, you know, if you're going to have elephants, polar bears and seals, why not glass doves, I have to say. I wonder where they went, and whoever stole them, I hope you're really, really embarrassed.
They could have broken.
Maybe.
Yes, I probably would have smashed them. But I can see there is a kind of Lutyens-esque New Delhi kind of vibe to this. You could imagine that this would be something in a colonial building in India.
Yeah,
in
well,
the teens, turn of the century.
Yeah, I still maintain that it was probably due to William Cameron's trip to India that it sort of pushed him in that direction to create this. Goodness knows where he bought the fountains, but they are quite unique. I've never seen anything quite like them before.
They are fabulous. Now, we'll show you a picture of the back. One aspect of this, well, whatever we're going to call it, pool, is that the lawn slopes down here. It makes logical sense. But obviously the natural gradient of the land is to keep going down.
Yeah.
So at the back of the pool, you've basically got a retaining wall, and then you can see that it's at a much higher level. So your rule, Stephen, about the backdrop for ponds is broken here.
Well, it is somewhat, but you've got to remember that also this pond makes no pretext to being natural. It's a perfectly circular pond with a perfectly circular platform in the middle.
And a temple.
And a temple. And so in a sense, it probably doesn't matter. Although I do remember as a child that the shrubbery behind this particular edifice was much much denser way back, and so I think things have been taken out over the years, and so it did have that sense of enclosure more. At least I remember it having such a thing.
Oh, there you go. So it did at one point obey the rules.
Yes, and I have to say you don't have to obey the rules if you're doing something really formal, because you're not pretending to be otherwise.
Okay, so there are asterisks and caveats to your rule book.
Of course there is. Didn't they once say that rules were only meant to be broken anyway? So there you go. What can I say?
Yes.
Another thing I think that's particularly interesting in this garden are the urns. You'll notice if you come around this garden that there's the same style of urn all round the property. And these were designed by William Cameron, or at least he had them made. They may have been from a design from someone else. And he also used these urns up around the memorial cross at the top of Mount Macedon. So it is a sort of a unique part of this garden, and it harks back to William Cameron, who obviously was the most important owner. And I think they're very handsome. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our foray into Cameron Lodge.
I have loved it. The garden is beautiful. The temple is beautiful.
Yep. Yeah,
Fabulous.
Well, it is. It's a great, great garden of Mount Macedon. And I'd personally like to thank Anne and Steve, the owners, for their allowing us to come in and film this beautiful place and taking me back to my childhood, which is always great fun. You know, just seeing things I can remember from that period.
Little Stephen pushing over the elephant fountains, which I think are fabulous. Well, once again, thank you so much to the owners for letting us wander through this private garden. It's been such a pleasure and a treat. How could we possibly top this, Stephen?
No, we won't, but we'll do something else.
Okay, and if you want to know what that is, and if you want to come along on our horticultural journey, you'll have to hit subscribe. We post every Friday and find out what we're doing.
And don't forget our Monday shorts. So if you've got an issue in your garden that you think I might be able to help with, send us a message in the comments thing and I will try to answer it in 60 seconds.
There you go. But we look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye all.